Today's daf is daf Chav Zayin, and we'll begin 4 lines down from the top with the 2 dots. The Mishnah says, Elu hein ma'amodos. And the ma'amodos, we said, were those people who were in charge of representing Klal Yisrael for a korban tzibur, like the Talmud Shel Shachar. They would stand over the korban, supervise it. They would pray on behalf of Klal Yisrael. Lefi shenemar, Sav es b'nei Yisrael. That in the parasha of Korban Tamid, the Torah addresses b'nei Yisrael, the entire community. And how is it possible that a person, in this case the entire community, would bring a korban? There have to be some representative of the tzibur. So the Gemara asks, Mai ka'omar. What is the meaning of the Mishnah when it says Elu hein ma'amodos, and then it says Lefi shenemar? There doesn't seem to be a flow, a logical flow in the Mishnah. Because Lefi shenemar is an answer to a different question. It's an answer to a question of what's the source for ma'amodos. But first you have to ask the question, what are ma'amodos? Elu hein ma'amodos. The Gemara answers Hachikam, and this is how you have to read the Mishnah and interpret it. Elu hein ma'amodos, that's question number 1. And question number 2 is, Umatam tiknu ma'amodos. What is the source for this takana of ma'amodos? And the Mishnah continues to answer the second question first. The last question is, where do we learn ma'amodos from? What's the source? Lefi shenemar, since it says in the parasha of Tobit, Sav es b'nei Yisrael. And the pasuk is addressing Klal Yisrael. So that means that all of Bnei Yisrael have a portion in the korban tamid. And the Tmidim are coming from the machzis hashekel that each one donated to the Trumas HaLishka. Behech karbona shel adam karev hu eino omed al gabav. Once the Torah has told us that this korban, the tamid, is the korban of all of Klal Yisrael, it's impossible that we bring a korban and the Bala korban is not standing over the korban, because the Torah says Tishmeru. And the Sifri derives from the word Tishmeru, that a person is chayav, he's obligated. Lamad al karbana lishmar olav b'shashu karev. He has to supervise that everything is done kedasu kedin. And here, who are the bailim? It's all of Klal Yisrael. So it must be that we have a takana called ma'amodos of those who are shluchim and representatives of Klal Yisrael. But now the second question, which is the first question that we mentioned, is Elu hein ma'amodos, which means, what are the ma'amodos? Is kinu neviim rishonim? This was the takana of the early neviim, to divide up all the kohanim that are royal avoda to 24 mishmaros. Each mishmar, each group of kohanim, was assigned a week's work in the Beis Hamikdash to do the avoda until they were replaced by the second mishmar, the next mishmar, the incoming mishmar. And parallel, corresponding to all these 24 mishmaros, I'll call mishmar by a mamad b'Yushalayim shel kohanim v'shel levim v'shel Yisraelim. There were mishmaros that represented all of Klal Yisrael, the entire cross-section, whether it was Kohanim, Levim, Yisraelim. And when it was time to bring the korban, Higias man mishmar lalos, hakohanim Levim olim liyushalayim. Those who were designated for that mishmar would now gather together from all the corners of Eretz Yisrael and come up to Yushalayim. The Kohanim would do the avodah. That was their mishmar. The Levim who were on call, they would sing the Shir Shal Levim. And the balance would be the Anshe Mamad, who lived in Yerushalayim. They would come to stand over the korban and supervise it as representatives of their brothers of all of Klal Yisrael. We learned in a brisa. Now this brisa is going to address where the mishmaros would stay at night and where they came from in the next morning to get to Yerushalayim. Esrim v'arba mishmaros b'Eretz Yisrael. In all of the land of Israel, there were 24 groups, but Shtei Misrei b'Yericho. Now, it sounds like the Bryce is adding another 12 groups that were located in Yericho. And that would jack up the number from 24 to 36. So the Gemara immediately asks, are you telling me that in addition to the 24 mishmaros that were in the other cities of Eretz Yisrael, now we add another 12 mishmaros for Yericho? So then Efishin Lanu Tufa, then the number goes up to 20, from 24 to 36. That can't be. The Mishnah says there were 24 mishmaros. Ella, but the real reason, the real interpretation of this price is Ushtei Esrei Mehen, amongst the 24 mishmaros, 12 of them, half of them were in Yericho. And now the Brisa continues. And what we learned that 12 mishmaros were in Yericho, it doesn't mean kipshuto that 12 mishmaros, complete mishmaros, would live and were located in Yericho, but rather they were spread out, and the 24 mishmaros were in all cities of Eretz Yisrael. So what does it mean that there were 12 mishmaros in Yericho? This is what it means. Igia Zmana Mishmar Lalos, when it was time for the designated people of that mishmar to come up to Yerushalayim, Chatzi HaMishmar Haya Ola Me'eretz Yisrael Yerushalayim, V'Chatzi HaMishmar Haya Ola Me'Yericho. They split up the mishmaros into two equal halves, half of which would come from wherever they were, the corners of the land of Israel, up to Yerushalayim, and they would get involved in the avodah. And the other half, the other 12 mishmaros, would come from Yericho. What does that mean? It means each mishmar was divided into two parts. Half of the mishmar would stay in Yericho, which was close to Yerushalayim, and then from there it was a skip and a hop to make it up Aliyah to Yerushalayim when it was time for their mishmaros to go to Yerushalayim. Now, why was this takana instituted that half of each mishmar should live in Yericho, and when it would be time for their mishmar to go to Yerushalayim, they would come from Yericho to Yerushalayim? And the answer is because of the close proximity of Yericho to Yerushalayim. Those who were in Yericho had a relatively easy task to supply water and food for their brothers who gathered together from the four corners of the land of Israel and came up to Yerushalayim. Those who came from other cities in Eretz Yisrael would have a real challenge in bringing up an ample supply of water and food when they came up from wherever they came up from Yerushalayim. They came from Tveria down to Yerushalayim. They came from Beersheba up to Yerushalayim. But those who were in Yericho, who constituted half of each mishmar, when they came up to Yerushalayim, it was a cinch for them to bring with them mayim umazon, not just for themselves, but for all the bnei mishmar. So basically, there are 24 mishmaros, and each mishmar is divided into half. The equivalent number for Yericho would be 12, because half would go to Yericho, and that half that went to Yericho would supply food and water to the rest of the Bnei Mishmar. We must have in Yerushalayim a mamad of all these three sectors of Klal Yisrael. That's ma'akiv. That's absolutely critical. It's indispensable. And this we learned already in the Mishnah back on Daf Chavav. And the language of the Mishnah there was Al Kol Mishmar u'Mishmar Hayamamad b'Yushalayim Shel Kohanim Shel Levim v'Shel Yisraelim. And since all of Klal Yisrael are considered Bailim, they're the owners of the Tmidim, of the Tom Shel Shachar, the Tom Shel Baim, because it says Savas B'nei Yisrael. We need all of them to be shluchim, to be the messengers and the agents representing all of Klal Yisrael. And Matzli Satana, we have in a brisa even more than that. And here we have an opinion of Rav Shimon ben Elazar. It's not even enough to have Kohanim Levim as part of the Avodah in the Mikdash, but we need ukli shir. We need musical instruments, and all the above are ma'akvim es hakarban. these musical instruments of many different sorts and types were blown by the Levium as an accompaniment to their shira, to their singing at the time of the Karbanos, when there was Akrav of the Karbanos. Now the Gemara wants to analyze what it considers to be a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel on the one hand, and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar on the other hand. Because Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel completely ignored the kli shir, the musical accompaniment, the instruments. The Maikam Miflagi, what is the source and the foundation of this machlokes? Mar Savar Shmuel holds Ika Shir B'Peh. What is absolutely critical in terms of the Avodas HaLeviyim, B'Shas HaKrovas HaKarban, is going to be B'Peh. It means the vocalists, the shira, at the time of the Akrovas HaKarban. And that's what the Leviyim will do. They will sing B'Peh. They are accompanied by kli shir, by instrumentals, because that embellishes the beauty of the peh, of the shir b'peh. That's called bisume kola, which means to beautify the voice, the sounds that come out from a person's voice, the shir salavir. And therefore, according to Shmuel, since the Leviyim are already there, they're standing over the carbon, and they are singing with their mouths the shira b'peh, the kli shir is not makif. It's not absolutely critical. Umar Sover, but according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, ikar shira b'kli. We shift the emphasis, and what's primary in the midst of shira is not the vocal sounds, but rather the instrumental sounds. The vocal sounds are secondary. And therefore, the mitzvah of shira is fulfilled by playing these kli shir. And therefore, the kli shir have to be there, and they're ma'akiv es-hakorban, because that's the ikar shir. Tosfos already points out that the Gemara in Erechin on Daf Yud Aleph seems to have a different approach, because the Gemara quotes a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Chachamim about whether ikar shira ma'akiv es-hakorban, whether in general shira is a critical element in a carbon. Maybe you could have a carbon that's kosher without shira, period. So how do we know that the reasoning of Shmuel was because ikar shira b'peh, which sounds like the vocal sounds in singing, is absolutely critical? Maybe Shmuel's of the opinion that ikar shira is b'kli, but he also like the Chachamim in Erechin that shira is not makiv at all. That was Tosfos' discussion. Now, the Mishnah back on Daf Chavav recorded that the takana of the Nevi'im Rishonim was for the number of 24 mishmaros. The groups of Kohanim were divided into 24 mishmaros. The Gemara is about to embark upon a study of a chapter in Divrei Yomi. That perek is dedicated to the names of the mishmaros of the Kohanim, some of which we mentioned on Tisha B'Av in the Kinnos. Omar Rav Chama Bar Guri Omar Rav Moshe Tiken Lem Yisrael. The takana of mishmaros and the number of mishmaros would evolve over the course of many, many centuries. It begins with Moshe. Moshe made the takana that all the Kohanim who are fit to do the avodah should be divided into shmona mishmaros. They should be all told 8 mishmaros. Those 8 mishmaros are actually subdivided into 2 different categories, 4 and 4. Arba mi Eliezer, Arba mi Tamar, right? After Aaron lost Nebuchadnezzar's 2 sons, Nadav and Avihu, the only 2 sons that were left from Aaron were Elazar and Itamar, and there were 4 mishmaros of Elazar, of the children and the descendants of Elazar, and another 4 the descendants of Itamar. Now that was from Moshe Rabbeinu's time until Shmuel's time. By the time we got to Shmuel, there were a lot more Kohanim on the face of the globe, Baruch Hashem, and Bar Shmuel, V'amidim al Sheishisra. He doubled the number. If Moshe Rabbeinu had established 8 mishmaros, Shmuel would double that number. From 8, it would jump up to 16. Now, we still haven't arrived at the number 24, so we have to go further in history, forward. But David HaMelech, he already was in a period in which, let's say 40 years after Shmuel, and the Kohanim were even greater in number, and Midam al Esrim v'Arba, jacked up the number of Mishmaros to 24. So we have 8, that's Moshe Rabbeinu. We go up to 16 with Shmuel, and to 24 with David Amelech. And all this is based on Direi Hayom. Shenemar, Bishnas Harboim L'Malchus David. This is already the 40th year of David's reign. That means that 40 years earlier, Shmuel had appointed David as the king of Israel. Nidrashu. Nidrashu means they did a kind of analysis, a census. Vayimotze, and what did they find was by Giborei Chayil B'Yazer Gilad. Now, right before this pasuk, and it's sort of a shame that the Gemara didn't quote the previous psukim. This is Perek Chavav. Back in Perek Chav Daled, there's a list of 24 Mishmaros Kohanim. And it would seem that only in the 40th year of David HaMelech's reign, which is way after the death of Shmuel, Shmuel actually appointed David, but died before David's actual reign, implementation of his kingship. And already at that point, during the period of Shmuel, there already were 24 Mishmaros. It was very strange. The Pasuk enumerates 24 Mishmaros of Kohanim, which sounds like, in its context, that it was only in the 40th year of David's reign, which is way after the death of Shmuel HaNavi. But Shmuel died before the 40-year period of David's reign. So apparently, to make any sense out of this, we're going to have to assume that although Shmuel did add and increase the number of Mishmaros, and he doubled the number of Mishmaros that were established by Moshe Rabbeinu, but nevertheless, there was still room to add other Mishmaros many years after the death of Shmuel, when David finished his 40th year of Malchus. And then the numbers went up from 16 Mishmaros up to 24. Basically, now the Gemara has to cash on Rav. Rav assumes that at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, how many Mishmaros were there? There were only 8, divided up in 4 and 4. Look at this price. It says, Moshe Tikein Lemli Yisrael Shmona Mishmaros, Arba me Eliezer, Arba me Tamar, Ba David Shmuel, then Midam al Esrim v'Arba. Shenemar, as it says with regard to the Mishmaros, Hema Yisa David Shmuel Haroeh be'emunasam. So David HaMelech together with Shmuel HaNavi established the number of Mishmaros Kohanim and Leviim, and they established that this should be noeg b'chol hayomim, on all the days. In any event, it says clearly in this brisa that David and Shmuel together established 24 Mishmaros. Rav Chama, in the name of Shmuel, Rav Chama, in the name of Rav, had said that Shmuel was masaking an additional 8 Mishmaros at stage number 2, and at stage number 3, David added another 6 Mishmaros, and he jacked up the number from another 8 Mishmaros, jacked up the number from 16 to 24. So at this point, we certainly have a brisa that supports Rav Chama's understanding of Moshe Rabbeinu, namely there were 4 plus 4 is 8 Mishmaros, but that developing stage from David to Shmuel, that is undermined by what it says here in this brisa, that David and Shmuel together established 24 Mishmaros. So the Gemara answers, this is what the brisa means to say. Miyasodo shel David u'Shmuel aramasi avidim al esrim v'arba Mishmaros. Meaning, they both added Mishmaros such that the total would finally round it off and fall on 24. But Shmuel established 16 Mishmaros. David jacked it up from 16 to 24. Now the Gemara asks a kasha on Rav from another brayso. Tanya, either we have another brayso. Moshe tikin le'el Yisrael sheishes rei mishmaros. That is about as outspoken as you can get against Rav. Shmona Eliezer, Shmona mi Itamar. In other words, at stage one, Moshe Rabbeinu, from ground zero, established 16 mishmaros, not 8 mishmaros the way Rav had. Kisharovu b'nei Elazar al b'nei Itamar. It turns out that the descendants of Elazar were propagating and expanding that population way above the expansion of Itamar, of the children of Itamar, is chilku. They divided the mishmaros, in which the descendants of Elazar would be divided to 16 mishmaros, and Hamidon al Esrim V'Arba, because Itamar remained at the number 8, which is the original number established by Moshe. Now we're adding another 8 to double the number of Bnei Elazar, the mishmaros of the children of Elazar, and now by adding that 8 to 16, you end up by rounding it off to the number 24. Shenemar, again, going back to Divrei Yomi, with regard to the division of Mishmaros of David HaMelech, it says, Vayimotzu B'nei Elazar Rabin L'Rashi Agvarim. When they counted the menfolk of the descendants of Elazar, they found they were Rabin, they were multitudes, Min B'nei Itamar. Twice that of the Itamar descendants. Vayichalkum L'Bnei Elazar Rashim L'Beis Avos Shishasar B'nei Tamar L'Beis Avos Shmona. So we see clearly that on the one hand, we divided up the Mishmaros into the number 24. Elazar initially, like Itamar, had 8. Now, at some point, they doubled the number of Mishmaros of the Bnei Elazar because of his massive population expansion from 8 to 16. Now, that's only at this point in time. But initially, if we go back to the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, when the numbers of Itamar and Elazar, the Bnei Itamar, were more or less equal, therefore the million of Mishmaros would be equal. And that means that during the course of Moshe Rabbeinu's lifetime, the Bnei Elazar had only 8 Mishmaros. And only now, at the time of David HaMelech, do we add another 8 Mishmaros. So it's not the way Shmuel, the way Rav had been quoted as saying that there were all told 8 Mishmaros at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, half, meaning 4 of Bnei Itamar and half of the Bnei Elazar. No, it seems like the Bnei Elazar from the get-go would have 8 Mishmaros. And that means that Bnei Elazar had 8 Mishmaros. And David HaMelech is now adding another 8 Mishmaros. The Omer, and the Brisa continues in quoting another pasuk in Divrei Yomim, Beis Av Echad Achuz LeElazar, Achuz Litamar. That for Bnei Elazar, they added 1 extra mishmar corresponding to each mishmar that they had originally, meaning they doubled the number of mishmaros of the Bnei Elazar. So they started with 8 mishmaros, they added another 8 mishmaros, all told for 16 mishmaros, and they didn't add anything to Bnei Tamar. They left them at the number of mishmaros that they originally had, and therefore we have 8 plus 16 is 24. But we see from these psukim that at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, there was 16 mishmaros. There were 8 mishmaros to the Bnei Elazar and 8 mishmaros to the Bnei Itamar, and only later they doubled the number of mishmaros to the Bnei Elazar. So therefore, that's against Rav, because Rav says that the total number of mishmaros at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu was all told 8, and that means that the Bnei Elazar only had 4 mishmaros. Here, it's clear that Moshe already had established 16 mishmaros. 8 and 8 for each of the Bnei Elazar, Bnei Itamar respectively. But the Gemara first, before it comes back to this objection to Rav, the Gemara has an internal analysis of the Brisa. Ma'avi Omer, why was the Brisa compelled to bring a second pasuk? What did we derive from the second pasuk that we didn't derive from the first pasuk? And the Gemara answers the following: V'chi teima, if you only had the first pasuk, you couldn't prove that from the get-go there were 8 mishmaros to the Bnei Elazar and 8 mishmaros to Bnei Itamar, because we could have said that just like the descendants of Elazar multiply comparison to what they were at the beginning, so too maybe the Bnei Itamar also multiplied, going way beyond what they were initially. And now for the Bnei Itamar Shmona Mishmaros, there will be 8 Mishmaros. After David HaMelech will add another 4 Mishmaros. But Meikara Arba, there were only 4 Mishmaros. So if not for the second pasuk, we might have come to the conclusion that Rav came to, that there were only 4 Mishmaros of the Bnei Itamar, and also likewise the Bnei Elazar. It was only when their population expanded that they doubled the number. Tashma, that's an impossible position, untenable. I'm going to bring you a raya from a pasuk that from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu there already were 8 mishmaros, 8 for Elazar and 8 for Itamar, for a total of 16. Because the pasuk says, the second pasuk that's quoted in the Brisa, Beis Av Echad Achuz leElazar, the Achuz leItamar. It's clear from this pasuk that they didn't add to the Bnei Itamar at all, but rather they maintained the original number of mishmaros that they had from the get-go, which means that from the get-go they had 8 mishmaros. And since they didn't expand in their population, they didn't add any extra mishmaros to the Bnei Itamar. And Bnei Elazar were 8 mishmaros from the beginning, but once their population expanded, they added another 8 mishmaros for a total number of 24. Is Tiyuvta, the Rav Chama Bar Guria, B'Shem Rav, Tiyuvta, this would seem to be a kasha on the tradition of Rav Chama Bar Guria, the name of Rav, that Moshe established 8 mishmaros, all total, 4 for Elazar and 4 for Itamar. Here it's clear that it was 8 and 8 for a total of 16. And during the period of time of David HaMelech, they added another 8, making it 24. More answers. Rav Chama Bar Guria Tanoi. Rav Chama will agree and admit that these brises are against his position, but there's another brisa that records a different opinion. And I accepted that other Tan. The Omar Shmona, who says that at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, the total number of mishmaros that were established by Moshe were 8 mishmaros, 4 for the Bnei Elazar and 4 for the Bnei Itamar. So now the Gemara is going to bring a brisa that describes the division of mishmaros at the time of Bayis Sheni. 1 second, I just want to see a note over here. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, what I forgot to point out was that if you go back to the original brisa, where the Masechet was, it says Moshe Tikin L'Yisrael Shmona Mishmaros. So Rav is holding like that Tana of that price. Tana Rabbanan Arba Mishmaros Olu Min Agola L'Eretz Yisrael and Ezra Sofer B'Mei Bayis Sheni Aval Shar Mishmaros Lo Olu. Basically, what's going on here is historically, in a chronological sequence, the Mishmaros came on Aliyah with Ezra. There was an original group that came first with Ezra. I'll give you a mashal. Like my wife and I came on Aliyah relatively early, many, many years ago, right after we got married. We were married, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 43 years. And we were able to get good deals then on apartments. People who came later didn't get such good deals. The same thing happened at the time of Ezra. All the Kohanim wanted to get first dibs at the Mishmaros of Kahuna, but it was first come, first served. Those who came in Aliyah with Ezra, they were elevated to a higher position. And there may have been greater Kohanim who were in other Mishmaros, but they came later. They were tardy, and they would not be able to vie for the high, first primary Mishmaros. And now we go into the names. The Elohim. These are the Mishmaros that actually came together with Ezra on Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, what we call Aliyah Shniyah. Yedaya, Chorim, Pashchur, Ve'imer. Again, very strange names.